Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In this video, we'll be discussing the topic of fair dealings. Is fair dealings aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Maqasid Syariah? Have you ever wondered, is it wrong to upload TikTok video in your YouTube account? Or maybe when you use the popular song for your TikTok videos? Or maybe when you quote part of the press release from the Ministry of Health Malaysia and you tweeted it on your Twitter? Or maybe when you using the picture of your Prime Minister and make it as memes? Or maybe when you share a Google Drive containing your lecturer slide to the members of the class? Is it copyrighted or is it not copyrighted, not infringe your rights? Okay, I would like to explain a little bit more on fair dealings. In this introduction, fair dealings is copying of any copyrighted material for limited transformative purposes such as comment upon, criticize, parody or copyrighted work of a copyrighted work. Such use can be done without the permission of the copyright owner. In other words, fair use is a defense against the claim of copyright infringement. If your use qualifies as fair use, then it will not be considered as infringement. Copyright law entitles the copyright owner to controls of doing variety act. However, in certain circumstances, the user may have access and use the copyright work for various purposes without having to seek the permission of the copyright owner and without infringing the copyright. Notably, in the areas of education, research, the medias, and access to the information, the copyright owners has right to control does not extend to this act. In the Malaysia context, there are altogether at least 20 permitted acts applicable with some exceptions to all works protected under the Act. The significant use of permitted act of fair dealings, or which known as fair use to some other countries, under our law, act done by way of fair dealing for the purposes of private study, number 1, non-profit research, number 2, criticism, number 3, review or by reporting of current event, number 4, are not infringing acts. Under the Copyright Act 1987, it allows certain exception to the Control Act given to the copyright owner. It means there is permissible act that can allow reproduction or reuse the work owned by the copyright owner. The fair dealing provision have been stated in the Act Section 13 Clause 2 of the Copyright Act. The fair dealing confines to 4 specific matters as I mentioned earlier. Number 1 is non-profit research, private study, criticism, and number 4, review or reporting of news or current event. Section 13 Clause 2A precludes the copyright owner from asserting his right where the reproduction, communication, and distribution or sale to the public of the copyrighted work, as is by a way of fair dealings for the purposes which have been stated earlier. So technically, fair dealings can be good. Because in the current situation, such as people can have access to education freely, they can access legitimate resource, especially during this pandemic era, COVID-19. People cannot go out to buy books or went to the library for research. Instead, people and children can access online educational platform and materials that are free on the internet. It can be bad as well. People would reproduce the study material in the wrong manner. They gain profit over the copyright materials, which is wrong, and that is not fair dealings. So next, I will be discussing on matters of explaining the definition of Maqasid Syariah. Maqasid Syariah, according to Syekh Muhammad At-Tahir Ibn Ashur, a great Islamic scholar, defined Maqasid of the Islamic law as the objective or purposes behind the Islamic ruling. He explained the knowledge of Maqasid Syariah is important for mujtahid to not only understand or interpret the text of Sharia, but also to derive solution to contemporary problem faced by Muslim. The concept of Sharia provide a clear guidance and framework to the process of ijtihad in solving the issue, conforming to the human interest while complying the will of the God. The traditional classification of Maqasid Sharia are divided into 3, which is Dururiyah, Hajiyah, and Tahsiniyah. And we, in our discussion, will be focusing only on the first one, which is Dururiyah, because Dururiyah are necessities are part of the essential element for human being. So we only gonna discuss for the first category only. The absence of this element may cause and damage to human life, which is necessity. What are the examples? The example is food, shelter, and clothes. The necessities are further classified by the scholars into 5 elements of preservation. There are 5 objectives of Islamic ruling is mainly to protect these 5 elements from any harm. The first one is protection of faith, hifzuddin. The second one, protection of life, hifzun nafs. The third one is protection of lineage, hifzun nasal. Hifzul akal, protection of intellect. And the fifth one, protection of mal, hifzul mal. So now we understand the basic concept of Maqasid Syariah, and we already discussed the basic concept of fair dealings under the copyright law. And now we will be focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals. What is SDG, also known as the Global Goals, were adopted by all United Nations members in 2015. Is as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. There are 17 SDGs which are integrated. That is, they recognize that action in one area will affect outcome in the others. And the development must be balanced social, economic, and environmental sustainability. SDGs are designed to bring the world to several life-changing zeros, including zero poverty, hunger, AIDS, and discrimination against women and girls. So, right now we understand the concept of Maqasid Syariah and the concept of Sustainable Development Goals. What are the relation between fair dealings and these two categories? We will be further discuss the idea of fair dealings to relate between fair dealings that we have under the copyright law, whether it is aligned with the concept of sustainable development goals and Maqasid Syariah in the next presentation. So enough for the introduction. Stay tuned for the discussion.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Dalila. As explained by my groupmate Humaidi, one of the copyright exceptions is fair dealing in the purpose of education and research. And the aim of fair dealings for educational purpose is to strike a balance between private interests of copyright holders and the public interests of students and researchers to use the copyrighted materials in furthering their knowledge. However, is fair dealing for educational purpose aligned with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and Maqasid Syariah? That's what I am about to discuss. For Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved, the most important key that will allow such initiative to happen is definitely education. When people are able to get quality education, they can bring change to the world. Education is obviously central to the underlying intentions of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. If we are to realize the ambition of a world without any children being left behind, without basic knowledge, without knowing the current issue, climate change issue, environmental issue, then this requires cooperative and inclusive action, not only by governments, but by public sectors, private companies, NGOs, and individuals. This in turn relies on universal, high quality education, which empowers people to take such action. How does a fair dealing help students and teachers accomplish many of their educational goals with a higher purpose of gaining universally high quality education to accomplish this fourth United Nations SDG? If you look at provision from fair dealing on educational and research purpose, in Article 10 Clause 1 of Bern Convention, it allows free use of copyrighted works for quotation with the condition that the use must be fair and the amount copied must not be more than what is justified for the purpose, and it must be from a published work. And in Article 10 Clause 2 of Bern Convention, it allows the use of any literary and artistic work as illustration of purpose for the purpose of teaching with the same condition provided in Article 10 Clause 1 just now. And besides, the name of the author when available and the source must be mentioned. The Bern Convention, in its Article 9, Clause 2, gives the state parties the right to permit reproduction of copyrighted works in special cases through their national legislation, provided that such reproduction does not conflict with the normal exploitation of the works and it does not unreasonably prejudice the legitimate interests of the author. While other international conventions on copyright do not specifically mention education and research exceptions, they contain a general provision for permissible exceptions modeled on Article 9 Clause 2 of Berne Convention. This general provision for exceptions is broad enough to cover any exceptions, including the exception for education and research, as the words in this provision is permissive in its language, which then leaves flexibility for member countries to draw their own boundaries on copyright protection. And this provision allow a high quality education to be implemented, as it gives many opportunities for students and teachers to learn in depth and effectively with the use of copyrighted works, as long as it is within the conditions provided in the provisions I've stated. And the example of fair dealing application in education or research is when students copy or post small portions of books or journals for supplementary students reading. And sometimes the students are just in need of one chapter in the book for them to study on or to do research on. And the concept of fair dealing in this matter will definitely cut costs, yet satisfy the needs of the students. And besides, the use of copyrighted sound or video clips for teaching also may help students with their understanding on certain matters. Many university libraries also rely on fair dealing in order to create large-scale digitization projects that preserve all the materials, as well as providing improved access to their collections for the purpose of research. Now, what does fair dealing have to do with Maqasid Syariah? As we all know, the objective of Sharia is to establish justice, to eliminate prejudice, and to alleviate hardship. And it serves the interests of all human beings and save them from harm. The Sharia laws are in one way or another related to the protection of these benefits, and this includes encouraging the pursuit of knowledge and education to ensure people's intellectual development and advancement of sciences and civilization. And the concept of fair dealing in research and education may alleviate hardship of human beings, which is one of the objectives of Sharia, as it helps to ease students, teachers, and researchers to make use of published copyrighted works as part of their research and syllabus in improving the understanding of students or themselves. And the concept of fair dealing also establish justice of rights between public and the owner of the copyrighted work, as it draws boundaries to the usage of copyrighted works, as proven in the limitations and conditions provided in the provisions I've mentioned before. And the conditions provided will protect and safeguard the interests of both parties. To conclude, the right that this fair dealing doctrine gives to the scholars, teachers, and creative artists in higher education only comes to life when they are understood, claimed, and used. The application of fair dealing's rights in higher education will be a useful tool in the mission of all institutions of higher learning to create a high quality education, specifically in dissemination and preservation of knowledge, which may contribute towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in specifically in this fourth goals, which is quality education. And the steps taken towards quality education also contributes to Maqasid Syariah, in which Islam preserves the intellectual or mind of human and encourage the pursuit of knowledge and education, as provided in a hadith of Rasulullah SAW, where he mentioned Talibul ilm faridatun ala kulli Muslim. Seeking knowledge is a duty upon every Muslim. So that's all from me. My friend will continue for other part of fair dealings with relation to SDG and Maqasid Syariah. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, fair dealing permits the unlicensed use of copyright-protected works in certain circumstances. Those certain circumstances are laid down in Section 13, Subsection 2, Para A, that include non-profit research, private study, for criticism, for review or the reporting of news. These circumstances are not exhaustive, meaning there are other ways to know what constitutes fair dealing of a copyrighted work, and further listed in the Act are other circumstances where there are fair dealings. Now, this subsection guarantees that the Act does not have the exclusive right to control the listed fair dealings, meaning to say people are free to take copyrighted work under these circumstances as they please. Of course, the Act provides the fair dealing to have acknowledgement to the author and acknowledgement of the title of the copyrighted work. However, no such payment shall be given to the author, at least not provided by the provision. The authors of a copyrighted work, be it writers, singers, artists, directors, etc., created their works as a means to create and acquire money to support their lifestyle. This provision would deprive authors from their source of income, since the fair dealing is able to take the copyrighted work freely and authors are not able to ask for payment. Imagine every teaching institution is using an artwork for educational purposes because they saw it on the news, and no one eventually buys the artwork due to it no longer being exclusive, but it is circulating everywhere. This becomes unfair towards authors. Because of this, Section 13, subsection 2A comes into play. The provision explains the factors to be considered when determining whether a dealing constitutes fair dealing. The factors include the effect of the dealing upon the potential market for or value of the copyright work. This then allows the court to determine whether an author will lose money, which makes the fair dealing unfair. It all depends on the court to construe something as fair or unfair dealing. This whole issue may be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goal of no poverty, as United Nations Development Programme is trying to achieve. It may not directly be linked to no poverty, but it does help the creatives, i.e. artists, writers, etc., uphold their right of claiming income for their hard work. This too aligns with the maqasid of the protection of property. In the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah verse 188, it says, "Do not eat up each other's property by false means, nor approach with it the authorities to eat up a portion of the property of the people sinfully, while you know that you are unjust in doing so." The Quran tells us to not eat up another's property. Similarly, for the issue of fair dealing, we may not take up one's intellectual property and source of income unjustly. In conclusion, fair dealing does align with the Sustainable Development Goal and Maqasid Syariah to a certain extent.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Arif bin Hamdan, and I'm going to be talking about how fair dealings are aligned with Sustainable Development Goals and with the Maqasid Syariah. Specifically, I want to talk about how fair dealings also help with Sustainable Development Goals number 16, peace, justice, and sound institutions, and number 10, reduce inequality. So firstly, I want to talk about whether fair dealings are also aligned with the Maqasid Syariah, in specifically preservation of faith. In the modern age, the spread and dissemination of knowledge is one of the most important things even a third world country needs to have. People with knowledge and reputable background would write books, and then there would be people who publish and print those books, and eventually the books would be bought and read by public en masse. Unfortunately, there is a tragic occurrence happening towards Muslims on the other side of the globe, where Muslims who have written books are being sabotaged in order to prevent the spread of Islam, either by not publishing or defaming those books, or straight up fabricating facts and later adding it to those books. The bigger objective of this whole movement is to make Islam look bad or to stagger the growth of Islam. But I believe that fair dealings can help to stem this problem of claiming that the works that Muslims made are plagiatory. Furthermore, fair dealing can indirectly is also helping us to achieve one of the Maqasid Syariah, which is preservation of faith. First, allow me to explain. First, let's talk about the 6 criteria of fair dealings. First is the purpose of the dealing. We have to see if it's for research, private study, criticism, review, or news reporting. These allowable purposes should not be given restrictive interpretation, or it can result in some undue restriction on that user's rights. Now, for most books propagating Islam, its major purposes is indeed for research, private study, and criticisms. All the books in IM Library are for these purposes. So if those who want to oppose Islam and wants to stop it, wants to use a legitimate case of infringement, they will fail because it is indeed for the purpose they were made to be used for. Secondly, the character of the copy. How was the work dealt with? Was it distributed to a larger or limited group of people that knew a piece of work? Well, in our case right now, all of these books are made and sold legitimately with no backdoor usage whatsoever, because any sort of backhandedness would be haram, and therefore any Muslim would try their best to avoid it. Thirdly, the amount of the dealing. Now, this looks at how much of the work was used. What was the importance of the infringed part of the work? You can either quote a bit or even a very large amount from the original work. But the thing is, in Islamic works, there's a lot of quoting taken from the Quran and from the Hadith. And although they are majorly important parts of that work before the current one, Islam encourages its people to propagate the message. So rather than a crime, you're doing good work for Islam if you keep re-quoting the work from a previous author. The 4 criteria. Alternatives to the dealing. You have to think, was there a non-copyrighted work available to the author? He had the option to plagiarize or to infringe. Well, the answer to that is plain and simple. No, because the work draws from the Quran, where all of works get their content from. So if I were to write a book on Islam and I would quote a hadith or a surah from a previous book, I'm not actually quoting from that previous book, I'm quoting it from the original hadith and from the original verse in the Quran where I got that verse from. And the last criteria, the effect of dealing on the work. Would it affect the market of the work? Now, of course, when a book is published, it becomes a competition for the old work. But this factor isn't the only factor, and definitely not the most important factor. Rather, I believe the competition would be good for the authors, as it forces them to revise their work and see if they're actually right or wrong on what they've written on. So I've shown that fair dealing is instrumental in ensuring the continuancy of Islam. That too is an act of the Maqasid Syariah, which is preservation of religion. It helps make sure that the teachings of Islam stay protected and is passed down from one generation to another successfully and peacefully. Now, I've shown that it's in line with the Maqasid Syariah, but is it in line with the Sustainable Development Goals? Does the Maqasid Syariah and Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, can fair dealings help benefit both of these concepts or objectives? Now, I think yes, because I'm of the belief that it helps for sustaining the development goals, SDG number 10 and 16. Yes. Now, let me explain them. Goal number 10 is to reduce inequalities. I believe with the inception of fair use, it actually can help to reduce inequalities in religion. This is because, like I mentioned before, it can help to prevent the silence of one religion from another that wants to quash it. It's a shield against inequality and vulnerability and oppression to the most important means, intellectually. It's a way to protect us even more from those who wants to stop the spread of Islam, wants to claim that Islam is illegitimate. Now, the next SDG I want to talk about is goal number 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. If no harm can be done to the peaceful propagation of Islam, then Alhamdulillah, it's more peaceful. If no clashes of religions or beliefs with one another. More importantly, it serves justice to the Muslims who speak truth, and justly so, from getting their work subdued unlawfully. Having that done to you from the work of your life is unjust, it's unlawful. So of course, with fair dealings helps to preserve justice for that author. And lastly, to be able to preserve the sanctity of Islam is a way to maintain our strong institution of Islam. But in many ways, especially in legally, intellectually, and most importantly, lawfully. So I've explained to you how fair dealings can benefit us Muslims, not only spiritually through the books about Islam that we read, but it also benefits us materially in the world we live in, with all the promises it has to protect us and to ensure the passing down of Islam. So even if you're a Muslim or not, fair use can benefit you. If you're Muslim, yeah, it preserves Islam. And if you're not Muslim, then yeah, it helps with SDG. It helps you make sure that you live in a more peaceful and more just time. So I'm of the belief that the concept of fair use really is comprehensive in its implementation, conceptually, in its implementation, and as a whole, very comprehensive and very complete. And it indirectly, or perhaps directly, covers many aspects, not only in our normal daily work, but also religiously in religious matters, perhaps.
So, we have come to the end of our video. I hope that you can understand the discussion and the relation between fair dealings and Maqasid Syariah and sustainable development goals. And I believe that our fair dealings under copyright law is actually aligned with the SDG and the Maqasid Syariah as discussed by my other members. And I hope that you guys can understand this video very well. And yeah, thank you for watching. That's all for today. Thank you. See you soon.